All right, so our session is now being recorded. So you guys are here for Executive Director Day 2 training with Cheryl A. Cosley. I'm Brooke Warrington. I'll be facilitating today. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. We're very, very happy that you guys could join us today. I do need to go ahead and read the disclaimer here. So know that this webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. So just try to remember that. Before we get started, I do want to familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. So if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or maybe just a hand. Know that with that icon, you can either raise your hand, you can agree, you can disagree, or you could even step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. So to the bottom left, you'll see a box that says Files. So here's where you're going to find today's presentation. You can download a copy for yourself. It's a PDF. Just click the item you would like to download, then click the arrow pointing downwards, and you'll be prompted to save or print the materials based on your device's permissions. And if you look over here in Files, there are also several appendix items that are included for today's presentation. So I do recommend that you download all of these so that you can have them for your information. The second box that states web links to, that's what houses today's survey, as well as any other links that are found throughout the presentation. Know that as Cheryl goes through her presentation, I will copy and paste any links that might pop up into the chat, but we would recommend that you don't open them just yet. Maybe wait until the end so that you can just focus on the presentation as it's happening. Finally, over to the right of the screen, we have the chat box. So this is how you'll communicate to the instructor or to us, the NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to interact by using the chat box. Know that any questions that you do put in, we appreciate them, and Cheryl's going to address the questions that come up at the end of the presentation. So if they come up for you, go ahead and type them out and send them, and then just know that they will be addressed at the end of the presentation if she doesn't end up answering them for you already as she goes through her info. We do encourage class participation, so if you have any comments that you want to send in as well, tech support issues should also be submitted here so that I can see them and try to address it for you. All right, and with that, it's with great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Cheryl A. Cosley, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Cheryl. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brooke. Welcome to Executive Director Day 2. And as she let you know, this presentation is courtesy of the Native Learning Center and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is being recorded, and welcome and good afternoon. We normally start in Indian country our meetings and our teachings with a prayer, so I did go and smudge on our behalf before we started. My information is at the beginning and the ending of both presentations, or all the presentations. Should you need anything, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. If I'm on the road or teaching, it might take a little bit, but I will get to you. So a little bit about myself. My name is Cheryl Cosley. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman. I'm Loon Clan, and I come from Keno-Shinkoning in my language, which is Place of the Pike, and that's the Bay Mills Indian Reservation. We are located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and our waters actually border Canada. We are Chippewa or Ojibwe people, and I served as Director of Housing for my tribe for over 28 years. During that time, I served on the regional and national level as I actually started as the chairwoman of the Great Lakes Indian Housing Authority, which is the 31 tribes around the Great Lakes. And I did that off and on for 7 years during that 28-year stint. And I served a total of 16 years with the National American Indian Housing Council. Started out as the secretary, went to the vice chair, did a 12-year stint like that, and then I did my final 4 years as the chairperson, and I was termed out. So I have quite a bit of experience when it comes to Indian housing anyway. So now I'm a proud training and technical assistance provider. So our agenda today is we're going to finish up learning about income and adjusted income and housing needs for non-low income people, waiting list, your criminal record information, your key program areas, your eligible activities, some of that program administration, grant management, financial management, your record keeping and your reporting, and some of the requirements, insurance and flood insurance. As I said yesterday, I would highly recommend that you download the appendix items for future use. Now, tomorrow, I would useful life. A lot of our tribes don't understand useful life and aren't quite following all the rules as far as that goes. As far as the insurance requirements too. So I would like to make sure, hopefully you guys can get that part and attend tomorrow. We're going to also discuss the Indian Housing Plan, the annual performance report, some of our required governance documents, the importance of your board meeting minutes, what they're going to look at there, and understanding your local ONAP office, the Office of Native American Programs. Who do you call for what? And it'll touch on their mission and their organization also. So hopefully that'll be some good information for you. Yesterday, when we got to the slide on housing standards, it was slide 83. I had failed to update my slide to the newest total development cost reference. Now, the material which I supplied you was correct. It was the newest one, but I had failed to give you the updated number. So your total development cost, I would make sure that you look at that. And then also, there is a new guidance finally published on our income limits, and she is going to put a link in here for you. I would highly recommend that you grab that link and download those couple of pages, bring it to your ED if you're not the ED, bring it to your occupancy staff if you are. If you haven't updated to the 2023 standards that were finally printed and published like on the 6th of last week, we've got some new numbers out there. So we can qualify some more members. So that's really, really important. Once a year, so all those come out. So somebody's got some work to do in comparing, your different counties and things like that, comparing it to that median income, but those new numbers are out. So that's really important. So adjusted income is the family's payment based on a percentage of their income. Your annual income first has to be adjusted. You take your annual income minus all those eligible deductions, and that's how you come up with your adjusted income. It's derived by subtracting any of the 5 deductions. They're standard deductions or allowances that apply to that household from the household's annual income. The household's eligibility for deductions depends in part on what type of household you're dealing with. So as I referenced yesterday, there's special rules if you are the head of the household, the spouse or the co-head, or the sole member. Certain things can take place if you do sit in that position, and there's certain deductions that you can't have if you sit in that position, okay? So it's really important to know what applies to what. So the statutory deductions, and some of the tribes, I've seen a lot of mistakes in this area when it comes to like the child care deduction and the travel expense deduction. I'll see one being offered, none being offered. I've actually seen where you can have one but not the other. No, that's not the case. These are statutory federal deductions that you have to offer, okay? If you don't, write a policy, write a procedure, and start using that right now, because that's less income your families actually have or have to claim, So there's a statutory deduction for $480 for any child under the age of 18. Any disabled person over the age of 18. Anytime or a full-time student over the age of 18, as long, and this is one of those situations, as they are not the sole occupant, the head of household or that co-head, okay? If you are the co-head, the sole occupant, or the head of household, and you go to school, you don't get that deduction. So there's a $400 deduction for an elderly or a disabled family. A deduction for attendant care expenses over 3% of annual income for any type of a family. Okay, so attendant care goes to anyone. Medical expenses, okay, that's another 3%. Medical expenses over 3% of annual income. And this is only for elderly or disabled families, okay? So it's really important that your staff that does these calculations understands this. So a $400 elderly or disabled family deduction, okay, gets back to that definition I gave you of the co-head, the sole occupant, or the spouse, okay? That $400 elderly or disabled family deduction should only be allowed if it's the head, the co-head, or the spouse that's age 62 or older, or a person with disabilities. So if I'm 40 years old, my husband's 45, but my mother lives with me and she's 80, we're not an elderly household because she is not the head or the co-head, okay? Same scenario, 40 and 45, our daughter is disabled. We're not a disabled household because the disabled person is not the head, co-head, or sole occupant, okay? So that's the special conditions that you have to make sure that they understand. So the statutory deductions, childcare expenses that enable a family member to work or to go to school. Okay, you need a policy for your childcare. We'll pay it until they're 13. Okay, this is a reimbursed or allowance. Earned income of minors under the age of 18 don't count. Okay. Travel expenses, not to exceed $25 per family per week, not per person, per family. So $1,300 a year max, but you need a policy. Here, it's 20 to 25 miles, depending on where you are on the reservation, to the nearest town. We have a college, but there's also a college there. So our travel expense allowance was anything over 20 miles. And you would be allowed excess travel expenses. Okay, so you have to have that perimeter and that policy to go along with these statutory deductions. Also ask for a Google map or a MapQuest showing the place of employment or the place of schooling where they're, obtaining their schooling at from their home address. And that's the documentation you put in the file to allow for the allowance. Other exclusions provided in your local housing policies, should your board have adopted any or adopted any. So those deductions are applicable regardless of which method of calculating annual income is used. So make sure you're offering all of those deductions to your tribal members. So your head of the household, the head of the family, the spouse, and the co-head can never be a dependent. They can never receive that deduction. Now, depending on what you call a foster child, okay? A foster child, and this kind of came over from public housing, an unborn child, a child that is yet to join the family, or a live-in attendant may never be counted as a dependent, okay? Now, our people always take in our children. Nobody's left out there, So your board could actually give the $480 deduction or whatever deduction they see fit. They would just have to write a policy. Any child that lives within the house for over 3 months per year will entitle the family to the $480 deduction, something like that. I don't know, if that's how you classify your grandchildren or any other child, niece, nephew that you bring in, but the way the law reads, a foster child doesn't get the dependent deduction, but that does not mean that your governing body can't write language to allow that. So qualifying as a dependent those in the household who are under the age of 18, a full-time student over the age of 18, as long as they're not that sole occupant, okay? So these are the rules for the full-time student. $480 statutory deduction for a full-time student over the age of 18. Does not apply to a student who is the head of the household or the spouse. You don't get the deduction, and you have to count their income. So if they are not, let's say it's your son, you're 40 and 45 and your son's 18, so he's not the head of household or the sole occupant, and he works, he could make $30,000 a year, as well as, as long as he's going to school full time, and you would just count that first 480 of their income, okay? So they'd get a 480 deduction as a dependent, and then you'd have to count the first 480 of whatever they make, and that's all you count. But make sure they're in school full time, and you should, verify basically that you're counting them on your taxes. So the adult students living away from home, if they're counted as a member of your household in determining the household size, when you're comparing them to those HUD income limits that I just talked about, that first 480 of the student's income must be counted in your household income. Note that that 480 limit does not apply to a student who is the head of household or the sole occupant or the spouse. You got to count that full income, okay? To count the adult as a student, to count the adult student as a household member, the adult student would need to be verified as a dependent, usually on the parent's tax return. So it gets kind of spicy there. As soon as I don't live in a HUD house, but as soon as my son was old enough, because he always worked, and then he started going to school, he was filing his own taxes because he could make more, and he was actually seeing the money that way. So sometimes you got to check that part out. So additionally, student status should be verified with documentation in the file. You should have full-time student verification, some type of form to prove that. So childcare. This is my great niece and nephew. They are twins, boy and a girl. So this was Halloween time. Enables a family member to be gainfully employed or further his or her education. The amount deducted should not exceed their employment income. The amount is not paid or reimbursed. Child care expenses incurred to permit a family member to work must not exceed the amount earned by the family member made available to work during the hours which child care is paid. Okay, so if they make $600 selling pies, they can't take an $800 allowance for childcare. Okay, it's got to be 600 or less. And you should be verifying the hours in which that childcare is paid. So they shouldn't be paying for childcare from 8 to midnight if they're working from 9 to 1. Okay, in the afternoon. So get a child care verification form and put one together. Same thing as your excessive travel. The allowance is for the benefit of families who must travel long distances to and from work or school. Important to remember that this allowance can only be allowed for excessive travel for employment or education purposes. The allowance must be reasonable, may not exceed $25 per week for the entire household, not per traveler. $1,300 a year maximum. Make sure you've got your criteria within your policy. So now you've got all those deductions into play. So how you calculate that maximum payment? You take their annual income, you substitute those statutory deductions that we just talked about. That gives you what they call an annual adjusted income. That annual adjusted income is then divided by the 12 months of the year, and that's their monthly adjusted income. You take that monthly adjusted income and you multiply that times 30%, okay? That is the maximum payment that you can charge them. As I said yesterday, even if you have minimum rents, if they make zero, 30% of zero is zero, okay? You cannot charge your families over 30% of their adjusted income unless they fall between 80 and 100% on the scales that were just published or given to you in the link today. So make sure that you're on that. So deductions based on the type of household. If you are in an elderly or a disabled household, okay, so that's when you are the head of the household or the spouse or the sole occupant, you are entitled to everything, okay? If you are not elderly or disabled and you're just a family, you are not eligible for the elderly or disabled household deduction, nor are you eligible for the medical expenses in excess of 3%. Okay. Those are the two deductions you wouldn't be eligible for. So then we have the tribes that decide. Okay. I'm working with the tribe right now, looking at their IHP this morning, and nope, we're not going to help any of our members that are over 80% of median income. We have enough housing in the area where they should be able to take care of themselves. Then you can get into some other areas and there is no other housing, so they try to help them. You have to make certain decisions if you would like to help your tribal members that fall between 80 and 100% of median income. They have to have a housing need that cannot be otherwise met without the block grant assistance. And then you write your criteria in a policy. When the family resides in inadequate housing, when they reside in temporary housing, or they're homeless, or when they pay more than 50% of their income for housing, including utilities. You can write in your policy whatever your leadership deems reasonable, what their reasons are. And, HUD, HUD's going to review those, but if it's reasonable, so I have actually seen family resides to live, our wishes to reside within the pueblo or, within the rancheria or within the reservation. They don't want to go off on to non-tribal lands. You can build that in as part of your criteria also. So how many low-income families? So if you make that decision that you want to help them, you can utilize up to 10% of your grant for families that fall between 80 and 100% of median income. You have to list that activity in your Indian housing plan, okay? Now, should you fall, you've decided to do that, and wow, there's a big, huge need, and now somebody's got to track that authority, and you go over that 10%, well, then you need HUD's approval once you hit your, 10% threshold. When you get into 10 and a half or 11 and whatever, you need HUD's approval up front. So if more than 10%, you need HUD approval. If the family that you want to help is over 100% of median income, you need HUD's approval before you assist them. So those of you who have 1937 Housing Act housing, okay, a non-low-income family in housing assisted under the 1937 Act for continued occupancy. What do you hope? Well, you hope that your tribal members will find success and become successful and more money into the household. And you can make a determination then for your existing 1937 Housing Act tenants if you're going to continue to service them. So if you continue to service them, and some tribes do, and others will say, nope, we have other housing out there. They can go somewhere else. This is for our low-income people. Other tribes will say, yes, we're going to continue to service them because there's nothing else for them to go to, right now. You have to make a couple of decisions. How much you're going to charge them. First of all, are you going to continue to service them or not? Then you're going to put the 10% in your IHP. And then you're going to have to decide, okay, how much are we going to charge them? Because you can continue to service them at the same rate that they were getting, or you can charge them a formula that's actually will show you how to do that within the guidance, or you can charge them up to fair market. Okay, so you have to make the decision at what rate you're going to charge them if you're going to continue to service them. So that 10% cap on assistance to families between 80 and 100% do not apply if they were eligible when they applied for your program, and then their income, they experience that increase in income. Families that are initially low income but later experience an increase in income, but you have to put it in your policy. So look at your admissions and occupancy policy and make sure that that's addressed. So obtaining HUD approval, you submit a proposal to provide assistance to your non-low-income families as part of your Indian housing plan. Or you could request a proposal as an amendment to your IHP at any time, okay? Track that threshold. If you get over that 10%, then you're going to need permission for the rest, okay? So these are in your appendix items. This is the guidance. The guidance that gives you all the direction on how much you charge, the calculations you use, the permissions you need are all within PIH 214.02. It's in your appendix items. This should be in the binder that your occupancy staff has, but you need to become very, very familiar with this if you're going to help anybody over 80% of median income. This is also where you'll find the essential families and the law enforcement guidance, okay? So examples of required documentation: property inspections, evidence living in temporary housing, verification of family income, a rejection letter from a lender or a landlord, letters stating that family do not qualify for any other federal, state, tribal, local housing programs. And then you need a moderate income checklist. You need to develop that checklist and that policy that you keep as documentation that they had to utilize your Indian housing block grant dollars, and they met that by, your checklist, and you keep that in the file. Temporary housing, your documentation. What do you have? Family desires residence on reservation or in village, So those income rental payment requirements. The rents, including homebuyer payments, under a lease purchase agreement to be paid by a non-low-income family cannot be less than what you charge your low-income tenants, okay? So there is a rental calculation that you do, and it's outlined within that guidance, or you charge them up to fair market value. You have to pick one or the other. You can't charge one fair market and use the calculation for somebody else. That's one thing HUD wants to see is consistency in everything you do, okay? So, the rents, including homebuyer payments under a lease purchase agreement to be paid by a non-low-income family cannot be less than that of an income of a family at 80% of median income, multiplied times their rental payment of the family at 80% of median income, but need not exceed that fair market rent or value of that unit. Okay, you don't need to charge them over fair market. So I'll give you an example. 80% of the median income for a family of 4 in Seattle is $75,040. The rental payment for a family at 80% of median income is $1,200 a month. The fair market is $1,793 a month. This is how I like to do things. I'm a very visual person. Your income of your non-low-income family is $88,000. You divide that by the income of your low-income family at $75,040. You multiply that times the low-income rent. That would come out to 1.17. Multiplied times 80%. Okay, excuse me. 88,000 divided by your 75,040 is 1.17. You multiply that times the income of your low-income rent. The rent at 80% would be $1,200, okay? So the rent of your non-low-income family would either be $1,404 using that calculation, or the fair market value, which we just showed at $1,793. So that's what you list in your policy. We're either going to use the HUD calculation or we're going to use the fair market rent. But you have to actually do that when you're assisting somebody between 80 and 100%. Okay. So to calculate the rental payment for non-low-income family, divide their income by 80% of median income. Multiply that number by the amount of the monthly rent for your low-income family. The amount is a minimum monthly payment. Your procedures should be addressed within your policy, and it's all within that guidance. That guidance is really, really important, okay? Also, somebody needs to track your 10% authority. So this is a small housing authority. They get $365,000 a year. Okay, 10% of that's 36,500. We're going to show you a scenario helping 3 families. They're helping one with the fair market rent. 698 is that rental value times 12 is $8,376 of your authority. Your second family is non-low income family. You're helping them with home ownership assistance. 850 a month, okay? Multiplied times 12, that's 10,200 of your 10% authority that you're giving NAHASDA assistance. So your third family is down payment assistance. You're going to help them with down payment assistance. The amount that you provide, because you have to again do a calculation. If you give your tribal members 10,000, you have to do a calculation for your low income members, and in this case it would come out to 7,400 is what you would be allowed to give them. So you count all those 3 together, you come up with 25,976 of your authority. You would still have 10,524 to assist anybody else that came into your program. Now, the next family that comes in, if it comes up to 10,525, you're going to need to get HUD approval because you've exceeded your 10% authority, okay? Somebody's got to be constantly tracking that on a yearly basis. So your other program assistance, and I just alluded to that, down payment assistance, rehab, mod, anything that you give them, if they fall between 80 and 100%, they're not essential and they're not law enforcement, they have to be charged a different amount. They cannot receive that same benefit as your low-income people. So the rent, including home buyer payments under that lease purchase agreement, to be paid by your non-low-income family cannot be less than what your non-low-income family pays, okay? Other assistance, including down payment to your non-low-income families, cannot exceed the income of your family at 80% of median income divided by the income of your non-low-income family and the present value of the assistance provided to your family that is at 80% of median income. So other assistance, including down payment, cannot exceed, exactly what I just went through. So we still got our family at $75,040. Down payment assistance is capped at $10,000 for your families at 80% or less of median income. You take the income of your low-income family, divide it by the income of your non-low-income family, multiply that times that capped assistance amount, and that is the max assistance you can give your non-low-income family, okay? So there it is. Your income of your your income of your low-income family, $75,040. $75,040 divided by the income of your non-low-income family at $88,000. That comes out to 0.85 times 80% of your max assistance, which is $10,000. They would be entitled to $8,500. Okay, so you have to use that calculation. It's all spelled out within the guidance. But if you're giving your tribal members that are over 80% of median income the same amount as you're giving your low income ones, you guys are in violation. So make sure somebody understands that, read that guidance. And if you need admissions and occupancy, ask for it. There's a lot of money, a lot of TA money out there to provide that. So what is HUD going to check when they come in? If that participant is non-low income, are they paying up to the appropriate rate, up to fair market value? That's what they're going to look at. Check yourself first so you don't get a finding. So in the appendix items, there's monitoring things. Use the monitoring forms to check yourself before HUD comes in or the auditor. So one of the occupancy review forms in your attachments, does the file document if it's a native family? Do you have proof of an enrollment or other documentation on the file? If they're not native, is there documentation that they're essential to the well-being of your families? What is their annual income at the time of application? What's their family size? How many bedrooms? What's the income limit for the family size at the time of application? Is the applicant eligible? Is the selection in accordance with the place on their waiting list? What is the amount of assistance or the purchase price? Does the file document assistance price? Is it within your total development cost? Do you have a signed contract for assistance? What was the date the application was received? Do you have a recorded useful life agreement? We're going to talk about that tomorrow. Is the insurance equal to the amount of assistance? Remember I told you about those insurance requirements? Pre-occupancy inspection documented. Did you make sure that you inspected that unit before they moved in? Post-occupancy inspection conducted. They want to make sure you did a move out also. Did you check for lead-based paint, or did you give them, the required documentation? Is your inspection conducted in accordance with maintenance or your inspection standards? Did you provide any type of counseling to the family? Are they current on their payments? Is the applicant, does there appear to be a conflict of interest? Was ONAP notified of the conflict of interest? Was there any relocation involved? Okay, because that's going to trigger certain things. If they are non-low income, between 80 and 100%, is the amount of their assistance prorated? And the other is, was there an environmental review required? Okay, so those are the things that they look at. You got to make sure that your files document that to keep you out of trouble. So that waiting list, they're very, very picky about the waiting list. It's got to be in writing, okay? Don't remove somebody from your waiting list without documentation as to why. It should have a signature, it should have a date, and then it should be moved to a different file, okay? They get really, really angry when somebody just disappears. If somebody asks to be removed from your waiting list, you make sure that you get that in writing. You try as hard as you can to. If you can't, then 2 of your staff need to document on that application why you removed them. Cheryl Cosley received a phone call at 2:37 on July 12th asking to remove them from a waiting list because they're moving to Tennessee. And then another staff member also signs it underneath there, okay? They look at that real hard. So your application form, it should capture certain things. You should know, what are the family's characteristics? How many people are there? How many boys? How many girls? Their estimated anticipated income, the appropriate size and location. What do you mean location? Well, we've got tribes, some of them have 9 different housing sites. Some just have 2, some have 1, but you need to know where they want to be. The appropriate size, location, type of home for that family. Do you need a handicap accessible home? Are they asking for a single level as opposed to, I'm old, I don't like climbing upstairs? Whether the family is suitable for participation in your housing program. You have to have criteria for deeming them, a suitable tenant in accordance with your local selection criteria. Whether the applicant can qualify for any preferences. Do you have those preferences outlined within your A&O policy? Look at your A&O policy. If it's old, redo it. Don't put all those things that they used to make us put in there if that's not what you want to give as a preference, okay? That's up to you and your leadership. Got to be a written application. Should be time and date stamped when received, okay? And then it should be signed and date stamped when you deem it complete, and you should require both. Okay, and I do not mean time and date stamped as complete by the front office girl that's in the other room. This is somebody that verifies the entire contents of that application, including your running your criminal lien. All of that has to be done, should be accepted and processed to determine that eligibility. You should document all communication with the applicant. Definitely the removal from a wait list. If your policy says they have to update their application every 12 months, make sure it says whether you're going to notify them when that 12 months is coming up, what the procedure is for that, follow it, and then we removed it, we put it over into this file because it's been 12 and a half months since their last update. Staff should help applicants complete applications. Our applications sometimes can be confusing, thick. You do that in a private place. Be very, very, don't have a staff member. Pick the appropriate staff member that is good with your tribal members. You're here for them, okay? That's a job that you do in private. You don't make them feel bad. You walk through it. Do you understand this part? Okay, this is going to need everybody over the age of 18. Can you explain to me about your assets? Have you ever been convicted or charged with a crime? And you go through that slowly in private in a non-condescending way. Okay, so you pick the right staff to do that also. Your selection policies. You have to develop a selection policy. You can establish preferences, okay, if that's what your governing body wants to do. Members of the tribe, persons with special needs, if that's what you want. Veterans, if that's the preference they want to give. Certain types of families. That usually applies for what type of program it is, okay? First-time home buyer or your rental program or, certain types of families, depending on what type of, elderly for your elderly program. Depends on what you're offering. So your leases, your rental and your home buyer lease must be written. They have to state rent, lease payment, administration fees, who's responsible for what maintenance, timelines. What do you consider timeline for adequate notice? Okay. Remember, business or calendar days, always specify. Inspection requirements, reasons for terminations. Do not do anything to your leases without running it past your legal department. Okay, these are the most binding pieces of paperwork that you'll have within your office. Okay, that's not something you can just add something to like you do a policy, okay, or a procedure. Your leases, always put your legal eyes on it. Your application package should be asking, and this is for every product which you offer that you have an application for. Your application package for all your programs that you offer should ask about the applicant's relationships with your decision makers. Okay, this is huge. This is part of your conflict of interest. It's your disclosure, okay? Who's the applicant? What program are they applying for? What's the application date? I am applying for the program noted above. I'm disclosing that I'm an employee, a board of commissioner, or a tribal council member. Or I'm an immediate family member of an employee, a board of commissioner, or a tribal council member. I'm a business partner because conflict of interest stretches out to business partners and prospective employers also. I am a business partner of an employee, board of commissioner, or tribal council member. Or I am neither to all of the above. If you are a family member or a business partner of an employee, board of commissioner, or tribal council member, please state their name and your relationship. And then the acknowledgement reads, I understand that a public disclosure of my selection will be made and that a copy of this disclosure shall be submitted to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I've been notified of my opportunity to receive a copy of the conflict of interest policy, so make sure you have one. And to receive additional information from the housing entity. I understand that this disclosure does not disqualify and or determine my application ineligible. So these should be in your application packets, okay? Because you're supposed to know about their relationship to your decision makers. Your other points of eligibility. Are you going to run a criminal background check? This is another thing. If you're going to run it on one, you run it on all. Okay, you can't pick and choose. That's not fair. Landlord references, any outstanding debts, program-specific requirements, family composition, tribal enrollment, conflict of interest, the relationship to your decision makers, their credit worthiness. Is it going to be a principal residence? Do they have the ability to enter into an agreement? What's their maintenance history? Have they trashed your houses before? Verification timeframes. You take that application package in, you deem them eligible. They have to be eligible at the day that you put them in the house. So if it's been anything over a month, run it again. Run everything again. The criminal background and their income, okay? Because they're going to look at that forever and ever. and then employment stability. Those are all things that you have to make sure that you're focusing on. And I have seen, remember, this is for low-income Native Americans. I have seen findings where they have been written up for putting non-natives into houses, okay? That's not who that Congress appropriates the money for. So your waiting list establishes an order of assistance to your qualified applicants, implements preferences and priorities, ensures fair and equitable treatment, serves as a source of data about the need and demand for units by size, type, and location. So your waiting list option, the number on your waiting list, what to include on it. Is it going to be electronic? How do you join the list? Who purges the list? How do you purge it? Do not remove people from the waiting list without a policy. Always keep as an inactive application. You don't just toss it. It goes into that inactive file, okay? With the signature, a reason, and the date that the staff member removed that application, because HUD's going to want to know when they come in. Sometimes your auditors too. So verification forms should capture the name, the position, the telephone number, the email of your information providers that you contact. Should capture their current and anticipated earnings and fluctuating pay rates and hours. You may want to consider including self-addressed stamped envelopes with each individual verification form mailed out. HUD does not want our tenants to hand carry the verification and the income back to us. You're supposed to be trying to bypass that and go directly to the employer, okay? Standard verification forms, consent for release of information, verification of employment, income, trust income, savings, pensions, landlord verification. Authorization for that release of information, that HUD form 9886. All adult family members and spouse must sign. Everybody over the age of 18 can be used between regular and re-exams to verify unreported income. The applicant's certification that income and other information is accurate and complete, okay? Have fraud statements up above your application package. So, everybody knows about, I was this many years old when I learned this. Well, I was probably, I don't know, at least 5 years in before I learned that that HUD form has an expiration date on it. It's valid for 15 months from the date of signature. So every time that they come in to do a recertification or whatever, you get it signed again. So it's current and valid, okay? That form can only be used for the verification forms sources listed on that form. So make sure they're all listed, everybody that you use within your area to check. So your release forms, obtaining information for verification purposes requires a signed consent for the release of information from the family member whose information is being requested. So that means also when you're going through and you're doing your research on a yearly basis, take a glance and see if anybody turned 18 within the last year and make sure that you get a form from them, okay? So collecting that participant information. All your participant information is considered protected, personally identifiable information, and it's required to be kept confidential. You should have confidentiality statements from your board of commissioners, from your tribal council, from your staff. It's a need to know basis. They don't have a right to go in and look at that information, okay? There's a program guidance, 2014-05. The purpose of the guidance is to provide the procedures for protecting that personal information, especially if you have to send any information to HUD. It walks you through how to send what, okay? You should have a confidentiality policy protecting the residents and applicants, okay? Whereas your housing entity provides decent, safe, and sanitary housing to low-income Native households in accordance with HUD guidelines. Whereas your housing entity seeks to protect the interest of your residents and applicants by prohibiting the exploitive use of personal information to the extent permitted by tribal and state law. The housing entity is also mandated by HUD confidentiality requirements to protect your tenant information and housing authority records. In all cases, the release of your housing authority records requires the prior written approval of the housing authority's executive director. Now, therefore, be resolved that this is the policy of the housing authority, protect the interest of the people we serve to the maximum extent permitted by law. All employees and members of the authority, including the housing commissioners and tribal council, are required to abide by this standard. Only inspectors, auditors, investigators, and others who are engaged in their normal functions as approved by HUD may have access to confidential information concerning residents and applicants. Okay, so make sure that you have something to that effect that's passed and signed by your incoming people. So the National Crime Information Center, we are allowed to run the criminal background history used for purposes of applicant screening, lease enforcement, and eviction. Okay. We are also allowed to run a criminal background on any prospective housing employee. We are in very, very sensitive positions. So the statute also allows that. For purposes of this guidance, tenants include home buyers applying for, currently being assisted under NAHASDA. As stated above, recipients should have specific written tenant selection policies that are implemented fairly and consistently. And the recipient may wish to have a policy that restricts or forbids occupancy to tenants or potential tenants or homebuyers who have had a criminal conviction of any type or kind, or specific types of criminal convictions. For prospective tenants of housing assisted with block grant funds, recipients may obtain criminal history records to aid in applicant screening, lease enforcement, and eviction. You can read about that at the regs at 1152. In this case, tenants include homebuyers who are purchasing their home through a lease purchase agreement with the recipient and homebuyers seeking housing assistance. So even down payment assistance, okay? But we are allowed to run that criminal background. So under 150, how can Indian tribes and TDHEs receive criminal conviction information on applicants for employment and or adult applicants for housing assistance or tenants? So as required by the statute, the National Crime Information Center, police department, other law enforcement agencies shall provide criminal conviction information to Indian tribes. So if you haven't done this before and you would like to get this information, you pull down all the criteria, call your HUD office, bring down the guidance, and bring it to your legal department and say, we would like to run criminal liens. Can you set me up? Now, at one time I had my ORI, an ORI number, just like the police department did. Give us the right. You have to be very, very, very strict about doing this. I was allowed to see them, and one of my staff, not even my assistant, okay, has to be under lock and key. We're the only people that are allowed to see it. You don't even show the tenant that information. You can read to them and tell them what's on there, but you don't hand them the record. Under lock and key, only for the purposes of putting them in housing, okay? Or we also ran the criminal lien when they were transferring units. That was the only other time. Kept the proof with the application right there that they had asked to come into housing, and that was stapled to that and tell the need for what it was used for, and then you actually destroy that record. Okay, there's very strict rules, and at one time I used to have to go through a state police audit to be able to do that. That's very, very private information. Okay, for the purposes of this section, terms tenant include home buyers who are purchasing a home pursuant to a lease purchase agreement. Okay, as required by Section 208 of NAHASDA, the Crime Information Center, police departments, law enforcement agencies shall provide criminal conviction information to tribes, TDHEs upon request. Information regarding juveniles shall only be released to the extent such release is authorized by law in the applicable state, Indian tribe, or locality. So how is the recipient to use that criminal conviction information? With regard to adult tenants and applicants for housing assistance, you shall use the criminal conviction information described at 1150 only for applicant screening, lease enforcement, and eviction actions. With regards to applicants for employment, okay, those are your housing applicants for staff, the recipient shall use the criminal conviction information described at 150 for the purposes set out in Section 208 of NAHASDA. The criminal conviction information described at 150 may be disclosed only to any person who has a job-related need for the information, who is an authorized officer, employee, or representative of the recipient or the owner of housing assisted under NAHASDA. So how do you keep that information confidential? You find that under 154. You're going to keep all criminal conviction record information that it receives from the official law enforcement agencies listed at 150 and file separate from all your other housing records under lock and key, okay? These criminal conviction records will be kept under lock and key under the custody of the control of the recipient's housing executive director, lead official, or designee for such records, okay? I had a designee because I was out of town sometimes and we didn't want everything to come to a grinding halt. If you have a designee, which you should have one, make sure that it reflects that in the records of your board meeting minutes, okay? The only other person that is allowed to see that. The criminal conviction record can be only accessed with the written permission of the Indian tribe or TDHE's housing executive director, lead official, or designee, and are only to be used for the purposes stated in Section 208 of NAHASDA and these regulations. So you must establish a system of records management that ensures any criminal record received by the recipient from law enforcement is maintained confidentially, I can't say that. Not misused or improperly disseminated, destroyed once the purpose for which the record was requested has been accomplished. Okay. So your criminal record information must be kept under lock and key under the custody and control of the ED. Tenant or applicant file should document that the criminal background check was conducted. So you should have a check mark on your checklist that the applicant passed the check or did not pass the check. The source of information, the criminal background record check should be retained separately from the applicant file for these applicants denied housing until the expiration of the period for requesting an informal hearing to challenge the recipient's decision. The record should be destroyed at the expiration of the period or at the conclusion of your informal hearing or at any litigation. You can read about that under the regs at 1150, 52, 54 provides additional information. So I served directly under my tribal council, okay? I wasn't a housing department. I was a housing authority and then became the TDHE, but I've always served under the council. I would see the document as one of the staff would. In a board meeting, okay, I had the ability to disqualify for certain straight offenses, okay? Drug use, breaking and entering, violent crime, anything like that. Anything that was close went in front of the board, okay? They saw what they did, what they served, if it was a tribal member, if it was a non-tribal member, female, male, and age. That's what they saw. Every single one of them voted. We took the votes back, and that was all they heard about it, okay? If the majority they voted, to allow them in or to deny them. If they allowed them, that's all they knew. They never found out even who that was, okay? If they denied them, then we would let the applicant know, show them the grievance process, and then they would have the right to plead their case to the tribal council in person. My tribal council seems like it always had law enforcement of some sort on it, okay? And the chair or the vice chair would say, we are charged with protecting all of our tribal members. Housing is an opportunity, not an entitlement. And can you tell me why we should allow you with this record to come in into our housing program, and they would plead their case. Now, at that time, depending on how long ago, whatever, I've been through rehab. I've been straight for 5 years now. I've done this, I've done that, they could actually develop an addendum, and they would have the legal department do that, no guns within the unit, no charges over a traffic offense, no domestics, whatever it should pertain to. And they would, if they agreed to it, they would sign that addendum that the legal department, and it would go right on their thing. And if they breached that, they were immediately out, do not pass go, whatever, because it was an addendum to that lease. Or they would flat out deny them. So that's how my tribe did that process. Okay. So you set up your own, you've got to be very, very fair. But like I said, you just can't hand over all that information to everybody. That's not, it's confidential information. You can take it, you can redact it, however you have to do it, but you just don't hand them that background information. So you have to maintain those. It receives from official law enforcement agencies and files separate than your other records. Lock and key, under the control of the director or the designee. Only accessed with written permission from the ED or the designee. Only to be used for the purposes stated under 208 in NAHASDA. You can't run a criminal lien because you want to know who the guy your daughter is dating. Okay? You better have an application for housing or employment for the housing authority. Only 2 reasons you should be doing it, or in our case, it was a request to transfer units. So it would be sometimes 10 and 15 years in between, Policy or meeting minutes should reflect who your designee is. So Program Guidance 2019-05 is the update to instructions for updating your FBI criminal history record information. So that's how you go about that, and that's what you'd look up to learn how to do that. Same thing for your drug abuse treatment. It's got to be kept the same way, separately. Why would we have drug abuse or drug treatment information? Well, a lot of our tribes are now taking, and we did too, a healing to wellness court. I sat on that board also. You will sometimes see their records. You will sometimes make an exception and let someone within your housing that you normally would not, because of a drug abuse treatment plan or thing. But there's also special conditions. Those probation officers can walk into that house at any time without permission. There's no inspection time. So you have to make provisions to your lease also. Okay. So be cautious if you do that, and make sure that you keep that information in that same method. Okay. Into our eligible activities and our key program areas. So as you decide now under NAHASDA what you want to do with your money. Hopefully you get enough money that you can do everything that you want to do, those eligible activities. It sets out a wide range of activities that can be undertaken with the funds from your block grant. Activities range from actual construction of your units to housing services. It's important that recipients become familiar with the NAHASDA statute, which is the first appendix you have. Sets out that range of possible activities. You as a recipient determine which of those activities you want to undertake. So there's guidance for eligible activities under 2010/03. Now, all of these have numbers to you. It might not have the appendix items, but you have the link now to get into Code Talk, go into the program guidances, go to 2010-03, and that's going to pop up, and then you have the law. And that's how you continuously, as an executive director, learn all of these separate components, because there's so many of them. So based on the needs and interest of your tribe, determine whatever program that you want to offer. No requirement under NAHASDA that you undertake any particular type of program, except if you have 1937 Housing Act stock, that CAS, anything built before NAHASDA, 1996 and back, you have to maintain those units, because you're getting a portion of your formula to maintain those units. Okay. You state your planned activities in your Indian housing plan. They have to be related to affordable housing. Your housing units developed under 1937, other housing qualified under Title II, and your units developed under NAHASDA. There's a wide range of housing types and ownership possible. One of the most commonly asked questions, okay, under NAHASDA is whether activities can be undertaken on privately owned units. They can be. They can be undertaken on private units as long as that activity is eligible and the housing occupants are low income. Okay, same rules, same income guidelines, unless you decide you're going to help 10%, Your IHB funds therefore can be used to rehabilitate privately owned homes to a low-income family or to assist a low-income family by a private unit. The type of housing thus can cover a wide range of unit types, including rental housing. It could be single-family, multifamily, single-room occupancy, attached units such as a duplex or a triplex, home ownership units, as long as you take into consideration the insurance and the useful life and binding commitment rules that apply, okay? Group homes for people with special needs, such as the elderly or persons with disabilities. Congregate housing, traditional housing, such as units designed to help people move from welfare to self-sufficiency. Typically, those units have a specified maximum occupancy time frame, such as you're allowed to be in this program for 2 years maximum. Halfway housing, such as housing for persons leaving, a prison or a mental health facility, if that's what your tribal leadership wants. Domestic violence shelters, emergency homeless shelters. It depends on the need and the wants of your governing body, okay? So the types of eligible activities: development, housing assistance, housing services, housing management services, crime prevention and safety, model activity, and your administrative and planning expenses. Your Indian housing assistance is the provision of modernization or operating assistance for housing previously developed and operated pursuant to a contract between HUD and a housing authority, your 1937 Act. Section 2021 talks about your 37 Act units only. Modernization, operating, maintenance, your rent, and your utility subsidies. We do not need to offer a utility subsidy anymore. That is your decision. Development is found under 2022, acquisition and new construction, reconstruction, moderate, substantial rehabilitation of affordable housing, which can include real property acquisition, site improvement, development, rehab of utilities, necessary infrastructure, utility service conversion, demolition, financing, administration, planning, improvement to achieve greater energy efficiency, mold remediation, and your other related activities. So eligible admission and planning cost. So your overall program and administrative management. The A&P expenses associated with the expenditure of non-IHPG funds on affordable housing activities if the non-block grant funds limits expenditure of its funds on your A&P expenses. It can help pay for monitoring and evaluation, IHP and APR preparation. Your IHP is the basis of your yearly grant. If you should be without a housing authority director, or you have a director that does not know how to put, brand new, that IHP into place, you are allowed to pay somebody to do that on your behalf. Do not ignore the date of when that is due. I think it's a 60-day window for an extension, okay? You have to make sure that gets in to get your money for that year. That's why that's allowed. And if you should look at that formula, you pull that down off the internet, and it doesn't look like you're counting all your tribal members or something is amiss, you can challenge that formula preparation, and that is an eligible use of those A&P funds. So they are limited to 20% of your annual grant or program year expenditures, whichever is greater, for recipients receiving 500,000 or more. If you receive less than 500,000, it's 30%, okay? HUD can approve a higher percentage, but good luck with that. Section 2023 is housing services, which you can, offer. Is the provision for services related to affordable housing. It can cover housing counseling in connection with rental or homeownership assistance, establishment and support of a resident organization or resident management corporation. You can do energy auditing, self-sufficiency activities such as childcare costs for residents, job placement, training for residents, homeless prevention activities, security deposits, first month's rent to permit a family to move into an apartment, payments to prevent foreclosure, tenant-based rental assistance, including those for college students, youth activity, which include youth sports, drug abuse educational programs, Boys and Girls Club, other services related to assisting owners and tenants, contractors, and other entities that participate in your program. Housing services, home fairs, homebuyer education class, financial literacy program, elderly services. Housing management services under 2024, prep work specifications, loan processing, inspections, tenant selection, tenant-based rental assistance management, and mediation programs. So your NAHASDA management or your housing management under NAHASDA, property management, staffing, operations, maintenance, and inspection, your admission and occupancy functions, staffing, application intake, occupancy, and documentation. And you qualify at different times. I think I hit on this yesterday. It's really, really important. Remember, you have to keep that proof that they were eligible for services forever, okay? So they qualify for that affordable housing at different times. Rental housing at the time of the family's initial occupancy. A contract to purchase existing housing at the time of purchase. A lease purchase agreement for existing housing or for new construction, the time the agreement is signed. A contract to purchase housing to be constructed at the time the contract is signed. Allowable under Section 2025, crime prevention and safety, physical improvements such as speed bumps, fencing, bus shelter, employment of police or security personnel, equipment for security personnel, the provision of safety, security, and law enforcement measures and activities appropriate to protect the residents of affordable housing from crime. So you can't straight up usually pay the salary of one police officer because the money has to be directly related to your tenants, okay? That's why you can give it to security because they're just taking care of your tenants. So be careful how you spend your money there. Call your HUD office. They will help you find and give you those answers. So crime prevention and safety activities covers a range of activities related to safety, security, law enforcement measures, and activities to protect your residents of affordable housing from crime. Then there are model activities. They're found under 2026. Housing activities to carry out the purposes of NAHASDA have to be approved by HUD. They have 60 days to review your activity. Submit that as part of your IHP, or you can do an IHP amendment at any time. Must be for or related to your affordable housing activities. Model activities, some which have been approved. Assistance in excess of 10% of that grant allocation for moderate income families. Your housing office space, your warehouse maintenance and storage space for building that. Daycare center for affordable housing participants. I've seen that done once. Community buildings and centers. I did that one. College housing. Yeah, that's so all of it. Did the housing office space. So you can do these model activities if that's what, call the HUD office first. It's the easiest way to do it and say, is this an eligible model activity? So other activities not covered by NAHASDA, economic development, okay, or services not related to affordable housing. Ineligible activities, economic development activities not directly related to the provision of affordable housing, or activities normally funded through a different tribal program, such as your roads, your social service department, your education department. You can't be just providing that in lieu of them doing it because you have block grant monies, okay? So your recap: rental housing, housing counseling, property management, maintenance of your housing property, leveraging a tax credit product, water and sewer for your affordable housing, gym for your affordable housing tenants, services provided by police for affordable housing tenants only. If using income generated from the use of your block grant funds, it's called program income. Eligible activities are expanded to include housing related activities, okay? Housing related activities, as defined for purposes of using program income, means any facility, community building, infrastructure, business program, or activity, including any community development activity that is determined by you as the recipient to be beneficial to the provision of housing in an Indian area and would meet at least one of the following conditions: would help an Indian tribe or its tribally designated housing entity to reduce the cost of construction of Indian housing, would make more affordable, energy efficient, accessible, practicable in an Indian area, or would otherwise advance the purposes of NAHASDA. NAHASDA requirements do not apply if no Indian housing block grant funds are used to fund the activity. Summary of the IHBG funds versus your program income. Under IHBG, funding allocation, interest earned or invested on IHBG funds has to be used for affordable activities, housing activities. NAHASDA requirements apply. If it's program income, which is the income generated from the use of those block grant funds, excluding interest earned on the invested funds, can be used for affordable housing activities and housing related activities. NAHASDA requirements do not apply if you're not utilizing any of your block grant funds. So, how do you determine what your housing activities are? What does your community need now? What's going to be needed in the future? What needs can you meet within your current and future budgets? For any activities you choose, what will the benefits and responsibilities be of your participants? Determine how the activity will be implemented, what policies and procedures will be needed to put forth that activity. Your program types: rental, homeowner, rehab, housing purchase assistance, rental assistance, and services. So your key questions are: what type of housing assistance is needed? What type is demanded? Do I have the capacity to develop that? And do we have the capacity to manage that? Your allocation approaches. Okay, you have to decide how we're going to help. Okay, the maximum amount of assistance versus sharing a smaller amount of assistance across more households. Am I going to give $10,000 out to 10 people? Or am I going to give $5,000 out to 20 people? Okay. A one-time assistance, or allow the household to receive assistance over time? Are we going to try to leverage any other program to get more bang for our buck? So when you build something, you need to take into consideration your block grant on a yearly basis. Because once you build it, doesn't mean your expense goes away, okay? So we're going to look at a rent calculation and show you the cause and effect. So the annual income of this model family is $27,000. They have 4 dependents. You're going to give them a $480 deduction of $1,920. They have childcare at $1,080. Their total adjustments are $3,000, knocking that annual adjusted income down to $24,000. Divide that by the 12 months in a year, $2,000 a month, okay? Their monthly gross rent, $2,000 times 30% is $600, is the max you can charge them. In this case, we have a utility allowance of $250. Now their rent is $350. If you collected the rent for a full year, you would only make $4,200 off of that family in that scenario. So we're going to take that scenario and we're going to look at the different cause and effect. Okay. Now we're going to use that scenario. That's how much income we're going to say all of our families have, and we're going to build 100 units. Now, it cost to run 100 units of housing in electric, water and sewer, trash pickup, all those things that the housing authority picks up. The administration of that, the maintenance, $900,000 a year. Okay, so you got to try to make enough to recoup your $900,000 or decide how much it's going to come out yearly to run those 100 units. Okay, so that average adjusted income across the boards, we figured $2,000. If we're going to charge the max at 30%, their monthly gross rent $600. This time we're not going to give a utility allowance, so their net rent payment is $600. Multiply that times 100 units. If I got it from everybody, my monthly revenue would be $60,000 a year. My annual revenue would be $720,000 a year. So at that scenario, with no utility allowance, charging the most I could charge, getting it from everybody, I'm still going to need $180,000 a year from my subsidy to run those 100 units. Now, my board says we want to be generous. We only want to charge them 20%. We're going to also give them a utility allowance. Not much, $100 a month. My revenue now dropped to $360,000. I'm going to need $540,000 a year to operate those 100 units. So then you have the very generous housing entity, and I have seen them, okay? They're going to charge 10%. They're going to give a utility allowance of $200 a month, which isn't a lot, okay? Now it's going to cost me that full $900,000 to operate those 100 units. So know the cause and effect that those different decisions are going to make when you build a project, okay? You have to look at that. You have to teach your leadership how much 30%, 20%, 10%, what a difference that's going to make, what your utility allowance by itself will make, and what it will cost in money that you can no longer help your new families. You're already assisting these 100. Well, now you're going to continue to assist them. Okay, so those cause and effects, you have to make sure that those are measured. You also have to look at potential issues if you are outside of your jurisdiction. So on tribal trust land, here we are, on land the tribe has, a sovereign land, civil jurisdiction. The tribe and our TDHEs can assist or limit that assistance to just our Indian families, because that's what Congress gave us that money for, okay? And we can provide that tribal and that Indian preference. If you are utilizing other funds with your block grant funds, you may become subject to non-discrimination requirements used for affordable housing projects, okay? Low-income housing tax credits, for instance. If you are building off of your trust land or non-reservation land, you also have to look at pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. We're not allowed to pay taxes of any sort with housing money. So that agreement may be involved for developing housing off of your reservation or on non-trust land. So look at 1,240 all the way to 246, the information on those regulations, and make sure that you look up local cooperation agreements in your appendix items, okay? It's going to be required. HUD will come in at one point or the other, and they'll say, let me see the cooperation agreements you have in effect for these households, okay? So the requirement under Section 101C and D of NAHASDA prohibits block grant recipients from spending block grant funds on rental or lease purchase homeownership units that are owned by the tribe or TDHE in which that tribe or TDHE has not entered into a cooperation agreement. Okay, why? You're not paying taxes. You need to ensure that they're going to supply the water, the ambulance, the police protection. So you have to execute these agreements with the township or the towns, okay? So the recipient has not entered into a cooperation agreement for services for these housing units with the local government. The housing units have not been granted tax-exempt status. A cooperation agreement is not needed for such programs as rental assistance or mortgage or down payment assistance, where the housing unit is owned by somebody other than the tribe or the TDHE. The two items, cooperation agreements, tax-exempt status, are intended to go hand in hand as a protection for publicly owned or low-income housing. The cooperation agreement is a contract between the local government and the IHBG recipient. HUD is not a partner to that agreement, intended to ensure that that local governmental services will be provided to the housing in exchange for payments in lieu of taxes. It's called a pilot. The requirements for tax-exempt status is to ensure that scarce funding be spent directly on the development of low-income housing. So become familiar with that. So your program administration, your key program areas, administration and planning cost, operating policies, you fall under OMB, Uniform Administrative Requirements, 2 CFR Part 200. We fall under cooperation agreements, subrecipient agreements, total development cost we have to watch. You've got the guidance on that, useful life, and investments. We just went over your eligible and your administrative planning cost, what they can be used for, depending upon your allocation. So your maximum AP to report on your APR, if your cap is based on your estimated expenditures and your actual expenditures are less than what you estimated in your IHP, those expenditures cannot exceed the percentage used, 20 or 30%, times the actual expenditures or your IHP amount, whichever is greater. Okay, so you have to make sure that. Reserves, you are allowed to establish a reserve account for accumulation of A&P cost less than or equal to a quarter of your 5-year average expended by you as a recipient, must be related to affordable housing. You have to state that within your IHP. You have to have operating policies and procedures, payment policy, eligibility, admissions, tenant selection, occupancy, finance, management, maintenance, travel, procurement policies and procedures, acquisition and relocation, and an investment policy. Your grant management is to make sure that you know your grant amount, what activities you're going to do, who your beneficiaries are going to be. You list it in the IHP, execute your grant agreement, select your participants, and then run that program. So these are the grant agreement documents that you will have to make sure that you have in place, your Indian preference certificates, lobbying certificates, various package that will be put together by HUD. And this is what your HUD 52734, that funding approval agreement, looks like. So your grant steps, you complete that grant agreement, you obtain that ELOCS, make sure you get in there and you at least query it once a month. You don't want to get locked out of locks. It's a pain. Complete and submit all your other documentation. ELOCS is an electronic line of credit control. It used to be, we used to dial for dollars, basically, and HUD enters your budget. ELOCS amounts, makes draws against your line item. The guidance is 2014-08. If you want to read more about ELOCS, it's a lot simpler to use. You can query it a lot easier than what we used to have to do by voice, but it's really important that you put on your calendar that you get in there at least once a month, because you will get locked out. That's your sample 425 form. If you're an investment tribe, all the old rules apply. You submit quarterly, but they've changed, so we don't actually have to do a 425 only annually now, okay? Accounts for funds received and dispersed. If you're an investment tribe, you submit it quarterly. It's due 30 days at the end of the quarter, and you note all your disbursements and your drawdowns. This is the guidance number, PIH 2022-15, which now allows us, if you're not an investment tribe, to do this yearly instead of quarterly, okay? There's the guidance for your reading pleasure and financial management, the key areas, okay? It helps your business run smoothly. Sorry, I'm running over, guys. Effective cost management, internal controls, record keeping, auditing, benefits, long-term financial planning, accurately organize your grant activities, effective and efficient use of your NAHASDA funds, achieve program objectives, fulfill your commitments that you put forth on that IHP, demonstrate your accountability to tribe, HUD, and your tribal members. Remember your financial management system. One does not, one size doesn't fit all. You have to tailor that to your staffing and your organizational structure and size. Refer to 2 CFR 200, the post-federal award. You can read about that at 200 from 302 to 309 for your financial management system and your internal control standards. You can refer to NAHASDA regs at 1026 for your administrative requirements for our NAHASDA specific requirements that we have to follow. So your financial management system will entail your accounting records, your internal controls, your record retention policy, your budget control, your allowable cost, your source documentation. It'll cover your cash managements and your payments. The objectives is reliability, effectiveness, efficiency, and compliance. So the areas of an internal control, your control environment, you set your reasonable budgets, identify your allowable expenditures. Your risk assessment managers and staff are required to use a written policy and procedures as guidance to identify your allowable and your unallowable cost. Your information in your communication system, your department managers compare your monthly budgets to your actual expenditures to review for accuracy, initiate corrections if needed. Your control activities, managers follow established written procedures for authorization and approval of purchases based on your approved budget prior to purchase, and monitoring. The accounting provides financial reports to your managers for monthly review, including the reports to your board. So your budgeting, plan to accomplish your goals with your funds available. Budgets are expected to be a realistic estimate of your sources and uses of funds, and you submit that as Section 5 of your Indian Housing Plan. It's important because it helps set your targets. The strategy requires funding. You identify your tribal priorities. You maintain control and accountability. It's required by the Uniform Guidance at 302. The financial system must provide for a comparison of expenditures with your budget amounts for each federal award. And when the tribe or the TDHE undertakes the time to budget, they're making a deliberate decision to plan their financial goals for the short and the long term. So you get your strategic priorities, you utilize your resources, your activities, find out who is eligible, your eligibility, and then your capacity to actually undertake that activity. So your record keeping and reporting, your key program area, your accounting records, good records and procedures allow you to, as a recipient, establish fiscal control, monitor your program performance, and control your cash flow. Your source document retention. Recipient of our federal funds are required to make and maintain relevant and reliable accounting systems to ensure that the information provided on that SF 425 is consistent and fairly presented as required by 2 CFR Part 200, Subpart D. Furthermore, recipients are required to maintain all source documents and accumulated transactional documents for expenses that you include on that 425 as required by 2 CFR 334. Requirements for record keeping is in Subpart F of the regulations. You must maintain records for a minimum of 3 years after the end of your program year that the funds were expended. If there is an audit or any other type of action, you keep 3 years or until the end of the action, whichever is longer. What records you keep? General administrative related to administration of your program, your IHP, your agreements, your policies, your APR, your organizational documentation. Finance paperwork to meet your audit requirements, your procurement documents, your contracts, your audits, and your budgets. Other documents required by your other federal programs or funding sources. Your project specific should include project eligibility, participant eligibility, always everything you keep with your environmental, your procurement, and your monitoring. And a written procedure. You need a written procedure for identifying documentation required for your tenant files, your programmatic files, and the way in which files are to be retrieved and stored. A statement of work for procurement, your SOW, your work write-ups, you keep your independent cost estimates, your evidence of publication and solicitation with Indian preference, your solicitation mailing list, your technical evaluation plans for your RFPs, competitive proposals only, your solicitation amendments and approvals, and your bids and proposals. Your technical evaluations for your request for proposals, your cost and price analysis, competitive range determinations and negotiation objectives for your competitive proposals, your memorandums of negotiation and selection for your competitive proposals and your selection decisions, your bid tabulations, your documentation regarding your debarred and your suspended list of contractors. Take a screenshot of that to make sure that you have those. Award document and notice to proceed, and you always have to send those letters to your unsuccessful bidders. You need to keep all your bonds, insurance certificates, your records of pre-bid proposal, post-award conferences, any type of contract modification with supporting documents, your cost price analysis, requests for payments, supporting inspection reports and lien waivers, and final inspection and completion certificates. There is a sample contract file arrangement in your appendix items that could be very, very helpful to you. We're allowed to utilize GSA, as is the tribe. We are designated as an executive agency. You can read about that at 2010-09. And then our monitoring responsibilities. And I'm really running over and I apologize. The recipient is responsible for monitoring grant activities, ensuring compliance with your federal requirements, monitoring performance under your IHP, preparing at least annually a compliance assessment in accordance with 403B of NAHASDA. That report covering the assessment of your progress, your goal attainment under your IHP, and your audit in accordance with the Single Audit Act. The recipient's monitoring should also include an evaluation of your performance in accordance with the performance objectives and measures. And at the request of a recipient, other Indian tribes or tribes can actually provide assistance to aid them in meeting their performance goals. Where you are a TDHE, the grant beneficiary tribe is actually responsible for your monitoring and your self-monitoring. HUD is responsible for reviewing the recipient as set forth at 1,520. HUD monitoring will consist of on-site as well as off-site review of records, reports, and audits to the extent funding is available. They are back on the road and doing monitoring, by the way, guys. HUD and or its designee will provide technical assistance and training and funds to the recipient to obtain technical assistance and training. In the absence of funds, HUD shall make best efforts to provide technical assistance and training. There's loads of money out there, guys. Request that assistance if you need it. So HUD will come through and review the current year and 2 prior years, unless when they get in there, they find out that you have non-compliance. So I've seen it go like one right now that went all the way back to 2016. So they can go back. That's why you have to make sure that, you do that yourself. They're going to do a sampling, the inspection of greater of 10 of your dwelling units or 10% of all the units you have. In your files, they'll look at the greater of 10 files or 10% of all the files that you have, okay? And then they'll look at your performance measures, your fiscal audits, your annual performance report, that you've met your IHP planned activities, that you've complied with the required certifications that are listed on that IHP and that APR, and that you've substantially complied with the requirements of 24 CFR Part 1000 and all other applicable federal statutes. And there's a lot of them. We have to make sure we have that audit, one audit rather than multiple audits for each other federal grant a tribe receives, 750,000 or more in federal funds spent in that fiscal year must have a single audit or a program-specific audit in accordance with the provisions of Subpart F at 2 CFR 200. Conduct in accordance with 200-514 scope of audit. You prepare for that, know your CFDA, your award numbers, prepare your financial statement, your schedules, be timely. Remember that new requirement, peer review must be requested from your auditor. Non-submission or submission of a failed peer review may disqualify that auditor from consideration. Complete the audit and submit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, not HUD, your audit. You have to make sure it's there earlier, and it's got to be the earlier of these two. And I've seen findings for that too. 30 days after the receipt of your audit report or 9 months after the end of your audit period, whichever happens first is your deadline. You can use NAHASDA funds to pay a proportional share of the cost of that audit if an audit is required, okay? Procure the audit, look at 200-509, prepare the schedule of expenditures, your CFA, prompt follow-up, corrective actions on your findings, provide an auditor with access to all of your records. And then flood insurance. Make sure you have flood insurance. If you are receiving financial assistance for acquisition, construction purposes, including rehab, in an area identified by FEMA as having a special flood hazard unless the following conditions are met. The community is within an area situated and participating in the National Flood Insurance Program in accordance with Section 202 of the Flood Disaster Protection Act. For this purpose, the community is the governmental entity such as the Indian tribe or the authorized tribal organization, Alaska Native Village, or authorized Native organization, or a municipality or a county that has the authority to adopt or enforce a floodplain management regulation area, or where the community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, okay? The amount, the financial assistance in the form of a loan or insurance or guarantee of a loan, the amount of flood insurance required not need exceed the outstanding principal on the balance of that loan and need not be required beyond the term of the loan. So read up on that program guidance 2014-03. And that's all about that, okay? And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Sorry, I went over. She's got questions for you, and if you've got any for me, I'd be happy to answer them. I do apologize for running over.
Not a problem, Cheryl. We know that this is very, very valuable information. I do want to point out several questions that came up in the chat. So the first one is from William, and he asked, and this was way earlier on, he asked, does the income from foster care count as income?
No.
No, it does not. All right. And William also asked, can you store the records electronically or do the originals have to be stored?
You could store them electronically. You don't count the payment to take care of a foster care person, but if the foster person that is in foster care is receiving income, making income, you have to count that. I better clarify that.
Okay, thank you for that distinction. Okay. The last question that came up is from Simona. She asked, we were told by HUD that we only had to keep up to 5 years of records. However, you stated they went back to 2016, which is 7 years. So she's looking for your advice to clarify that, please.
Well, in this particular case, they're making them go back and get all the recertification information from their tenants for that period. So it's up to you if you want to undertake that or not. I would keep them until the end of your HUD. Oh my God, it's not audit. They're your HUD monitoring.
Okay, it looks like Simona's typing right now. Let me see if she has anything further.
You don't legally have to do it, but it's just like when they'll ask you if, okay, for instance, this is a for instance, you have to give a HUD posting because you put your sister into housing, okay? You make the posting, you put it up, you keep it for 3 years, and your monitoring takes place 5 years from now. I keep that with just like those postings, I keep that with their proof of eligibility at the time, and I keep them forever. Because I don't want to be in the position they say, well, did you do that? Well, yeah, I did it, but I only kept it for 3 years and I pitched it. That just doesn't sound too convincing to me.
It looks like she's typing right now. She said that we keep them and have volume 1 and volume 2 with 5 years in that file.
That's awesome. Yep.
And volume 2 that is, and we keep the initial application file in both volumes.
Okay. Never heard them called volumes before. That's interesting.
Well, thank you so much for your input, Simona. I'm sure that was some information that others would have liked to have heard as well. So thank you so much. And Cheryl, thank you for all this information, this incredible presentation. Like I was telling you earlier, you are such a powerhouse presenter. At this time, I am going to launch the survey for everybody. It's really, really important that we get your feedback on these folks because this helps us improve our webinars. We're able to give the information to the subject matter experts so that they can make updates, make improvements, anything that you need. So please, 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 we ask that you fill this in. It's very helpful to us. It should say Executive Director Training 2 with today's date in Microsoft Forms. And then before I, say goodbye and close the webinar, I do want to remind you that you'll be back here same time tomorrow for Executive Director Training 3. This is a 3-day series. So we will close it out tomorrow with Cheryl, and there is still a lot more to go over. You can see the times that it's beginning. It's 2 p.m. for me over here with Eastern, and then everybody else's times are listed here on the slide. Please remember that you can access this and any other recorded webinars online through our website at nativelearningcenter.com. We have a Catheta webinars tab and a recorded webinars section. So you could click on any one of the webinars that we've done for the past 18 months. Feel free to view them, share them with your friends and colleagues, anything like that. Debbie is asking, is there a link for the Part 3 registration? Debbie, I will send that. Could you please send your email in the chat, Debbie? And then I'm going to go ahead and I will email you that link. That is not a problem at all.
Hope I see everybody tomorrow. Make sure you pull down those new median income limits because your boss is going to want to see them if you're not the ED.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Remember, guys, that's all the way down at the bottom of the files today. It's it has a 9 next to it, but it says appendix number 8. That's the item that it is. Debbie, thank you so much for providing that email for me. I will get you that information right away. Be sure to check up our upcoming events as well as our social medias, guys. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we also have a podcast titled Hopathenga. You could find it on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple. Once again, everybody, thank you so much for joining, and big, big thank you to Cheryl for all this amazing information. And we will see you all here tomorrow. Same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and